Hi, yes. So despite the grand title, what I'm actually going to be talking about is one technique that we've used to try and get designers thinking about data protection regulation in order to sort of move towards that dream of privacy by design. So yeah, I'm going to outline the problem space, describe the methodology that we employed. It's a study that was conducted last year, talk briefly about the findings, and then describe what we're going to be doing in terms of future work. Okay, so this is a really terrible illustration of the legal climate. Please ignore it for all the people that are specialists. Yeah, so all it's meant to illustrate really is that when we talked about the Data Protection Directive, designers weren't really sort of foregrounded in quite the same way as they are being now by the European Commission. So when we talk about privacy by design, I mean, necessarily the designer springs into your mind, and why wouldn't they? They're the people that create these systems with which we interact. What's different about privacy by design? Well, I went to the literature to explore this at some point in the past, and these are some of the characteristics. So they're not exhaustive, but I think they're a pretty good run through. So the reason I think this is important is it deals with issues before organisations need to bring in the lawyers. So when we originally conducted this study, we spoke to people that were designers in small to medium-sized enterprises and also sort of artists and people that use data out in the field. And they were really concerned about the legal implications of what they did. And they were also very concerned that lawyers are expensive and they had to bring them in at the end. And they really didn't understand some of the rules around this. So we thought this was quite a good opportunity to start thinking about how we might create a sort of an educational instrument or a sensitising instrument. The thing about privacy by design as well is that it sort of opens opportunities for the proliferation of good practice. So if we start designers thinking creatively about data protection, potentially you start having instruments that don't look like a tick and click box for consent, and maybe are just a little bit more sensitive, a little bit more socially sensitive, a little bit more creative. So the characteristics of privacy by design broadly are that it's proactive rather than reactive. Privacy is obviously embedded into design rather than thought about after the fact of design itself. User data is protected as a default rather than because you have to. Security of personal data is seen as an end-to-end concern, so you think about it throughout the developmental life cycle of the system, whatever that might be, or the experience if you're an artist. Transparency of processes to users. So this is about the idea that if you're using data and that data is flowing in a particular way, that users really kind of need to understand that that's going on. And how do you design systems that sort of raise these concerns or make visible these concerns to users? And finally, that we need to think about user-friendly practices when collecting and using personal data. And so the idea is of the user-centricism that you might think about as a designer also applies when we think about privacy by design. So why focus on designers? Well, I've already mentioned they're implicated, I believe, in the sort of the emerging regulations, but also because of the characteristics of the systems that designers are being encouraged to design. So when we think about the kind of the direction that technology is travelling, we're talking about technology that is unremarkable by design. So the purpose of this technology is to free you up from sweating the small stuff. The technology is meant to allow you to go about your greater goals so that it remembers to turn on your heating for you, or it tells you how many steps you've walked, or it tells you how heavy you were 6 or 7 weeks ago and that you need to eat less. You know, this technology is sort of distributing cognition in many ways. But it also decouples users from devices. So whereas previously there were some really clear interactional moments, somebody would sit down at a computer and they'd turn on that computer, and if you remember dial-up internet connection, when you hit the button and there was that whirring and the whining and it went on forever, but that was an indicator that you were connecting to the internet. You knew that when you were kind of doing that, there were different sets of rules that applied than when you were wandering around your home. But this isn't true necessarily anymore because there aren't those visible lines, because these kind of technologies are involving familiar items in non-familiar ways. So a really good example of this, and I mentioned it earlier to somebody actually, the idea of there's a product called Vessel, and Vessel is a cup. And if you put any particular liquid in it, Vessel will tell you the composition of the liquid in your cup, and you can access the information about it on your handset, and the Vessel will tell you whether you're sufficiently hydrated. So it's gathering all this data about the thing you're doing all the time. So these systems, they kind of know more about us. This is the way they're described in much of the literature and certainly in the media. And they're online and they're networked, which is where we come to linking to the sort of the theme of this workshop. And the functionality relies upon human data, and so it invokes the notion of morality and ethics because of the fact that the traces of your human existence are being mapped and modelled and kept. And users have very poor cognitive models of such systems. So, you know, somebody might pick up a vessel, for example, in your home, and they don't know that that's connecting to the internet, and they might have a drink out of it. People have given really good examples of how smart scales have been, you know, when you have go to somebody's house for a dinner party, and you go upstairs to the loo, and then there's scales there, and you think, I'll just have a quick weigh, and you weigh yourself on those scales. Well, you know, if you have a smart scale, then your weight's being tweeted out to the world, potentially. You know, so people don't really necessarily understand that all of these artifacts are being connected to the internet, the notion of the Internet of Things that's so popular at the moment. And the last few years has seen a tension between these kind of systems and regulations. And the example that springs to mind there is, do you remember the London bins example? There's a company called Presence Orb that puts sensors into bins in London. And as you're wandering around, the sensors would pick up the unique MAC address from your mobile phone. So, you know, and the idea was that it collected information about you and you could have better targeted advertising. But people didn't realise that when they're walking past a bin, that their MAC address is being collected. And so there was some sort of show in the media where people were saying, you know, this isn't informed consent. People don't know they're consenting to this. And London bins were forced to be withdrawn. So we're seeing some attrition in the world. And also legal considerations are generally dealt with by external experts rather than, you know, designers. So designers really don't understand what they're doing when it comes to this kind of thing. So motivation in summary, there's a climate of change. We can see that designers are being sort of foregrounded a little bit. Design and regulation much more closely coupled, so we need to think about that interrelationship. There are no existing instruments. So how do you engage systems designers in data protection law? You know, it's a job of translation. Law documents are incredibly complicated. Even if you're analysing them, it's, you know, it's a weighty and uncomfortable process. If it's not your main job, you're probably not going to want to bother. And so how, well, in this instance, we've done something quite playful. We've created a set of ideation cards to do this. Okay, so the ideation cards. Now, the reason we chose these is that they're a recognised technique within design. So if you are a creative designer, you'd be very familiar with the ideation process, and you would have cards that would elicit all kinds of different new ideas within a problem space when you're thinking about either designing a system or designing a product of some description. And what we wanted to do was pick something that people were comfortable with, and also we wanted to pick something that worked. So we had a look at the history of use, and that showed us that these kind of cards have been used largely to define and constrain design problems, but also they've been used in the value-sensitive design sort of area to support communication, encourage thought, support creative methods, explore issues. So they've been used all over the place, and IDEO is the company really that's most famous for these, where they've created cards I think that they've used in international security contexts as well. So they're pretty widely spread now. So now we thought extend these contexts to data protection. So this is how we developed the illegal cards. I didn't just think to myself, which bits of this regulation am I going to put on cards? We actually went to a series of legal experts, people that were professors, lecturers, scholars, practitioners in the field of law, with particular focus upon the EU data protection regulations that were upcoming. And they identified so we interviewed them, we conducted surveys, and they identified 4 legal areas to be highlighted. So they thought that the thing that designers most needed to focus on was explicit informed consent, data breach notifications, right to be forgotten, and data protection by design and by default. So those were the 4 areas they wanted us to embed in the cards. And the language that we use very much comes from the way that they describe these things. So in order to test whether the idea of using cards with groups of designers works, we conducted 4 focus groups, and we had 25 participants, 21 participants, predominantly male, but I think that's fairly reflective of the sort of the systems architecture and design community. So we had a mix of those people that were sort of from 2 years of experience to 25 years of experience of systems design of various types, people with mixed specialisms and mixed abilities. And we did have one group that we kept separate, special, because they were the systems architects. So they were people that really didn't think about design in a creative way. They thought about design in terms of, you know, programming. And these were the cards that we used. So we constructed what was fundamentally a bit of a game. And the reason we did this is, you have to create a problem space for them to be able to focus on. So the first thing we did was we created the systems cards. And the purpose of the systems card at the beginning of it was to give them something to focus on. So this is the system that they're designing. In this instance is about tracking truancy. And what we put there was who was paying for the system. Who might be the data controller, who the data subject would be, the kind of data that was being collected, and the purpose and the goal of the system. So all of this information was included in the text. And so we allowed designers to consider this for sort of, I think it was between 5 and 10 minutes, depending upon how the conversation flowed. And then we turned the next card, and this was the user card. So having broadly thought about what kind of system you develop if you're tracking truancy in sort of a crazy creative way, we constrain the problem by saying, okay, your users, the ones that you really need to focus on, in this instance, perhaps they would have turned the card children. And so suddenly they're thinking, oh, all this data we're going to collect, we can't collect all of it because these children are potentially, very, very young, so we need to think slightly differently. So again, the problem space is constrained. And give them 5 or 10 minutes again, and we turn the card, and we included now what we'll describe as constraints cards. So whenever you're designing a system, there will naturally be a series of constraints that you need to take into consideration. Sometimes the funder will impose those constraints, and sometimes they'll just naturally be, because of you're designing a system for a particular context. And so we turned 2 of these cards. And so one of the constraints was the system should not collect by accident or intention any third-party data. So as soon as you start including these kind of constraints, you can see that it's making that design problem incredibly problematic. So it's like, oh, okay, so you can't use a video camera, for example, right? You can't use all of these different types of things that otherwise we might use. So again, we're funneling down. And then finally, we asked them to draw the regulation cards. And in this case, I've picked explicit consent because that's my area of research, but also because this was something that came up quite a lot. For some reason, accidentally, that was the one they turned when they looked at the cards blind. In this instance, the regulation cards were meant to make them sort of start thinking about regulations, but also, again, constraining that design space. And what we found was that when people turned this final card, it changed the discussion completely. So rather than, they had all these sort of incredible ideas that they were going to have, but as soon as they started thinking about regulation, it was much, much tighter. And then we saw a divide between the creative designers and the systems architects. So the systems architects found the regulation cards incredibly hard. They didn't really understand why they would consider things like this, because you just bring a lawyer in at the end. The concepts as well, the notion of consent, they found very hard to get their head around. Whereas the creative designers saw it much more of a challenge. They got very excited. They were thinking about, okay, if we're going to create a system, they were looking at wearable tracking, sort of health technology in this instance. If we're going to create this kind of system, maybe we'd create a bracelet that had a series of beads. And every time somebody wasn't happy with a particular type of data being shared, they'd take a bead off, and that would be their consent. So they were thinking about different models that would not only make the user think about the data that was being shared, but also give them a very active sort of action to say, no, I don't want to share this. So they started thinking about it more creatively. What we discovered broadly was that data protection knowledge is limited, ad hoc, and needs-driven amongst this community, the people that we spoke to. So, people would only learn about data protection or privacy if they needed to for a very specific project for a particular moment in time, and then they'd forget about it. So it was literally on a project-by-project basis. Generally, meeting data protection regulations, when they discussed it broadly in the discussion at the end, was seen as limiting system functionality. So they saw a bit of a disconnect between sort of creating a system that was going to do everything you wanted it to and having to adhere to data protection. And they didn't really see it as their job to do that until they were told otherwise. Bizarrely, there was a kind of a dissonance between the notion of protecting the user through design, which everybody was really in favour of. So all of them were talking about the fact that we must protect the user. People kept using the word of, protection, keeping people safe. But then as soon as you mentioned data protection, they saw that as something that actually wasn't compatible with that. They didn't see the point of it. Like, why would we do that? They didn't see there was a relationship between those two things. And securing meaningful and explicit consent specifically was seen as incompatible with seamlessness. So when the kind of systems that I was describing previously, if you're trying to make a system that you don't necessarily notice as you're going about your daily life, making explicit consent and foregrounding that within that system design is a really big problem. And so they were saying, well, I can't get around the terms and conditions. We have to do terms and conditions up front, but then let's not think about it after that. So that's a really big design issue. There were also concerns over the threshold of necessary required data protection knowledge. So they were saying, you know, if this is going to be an issue, if we are going to have to start thinking about these things, then surely it's better that we create this hybrid person that's like a data protection designer, like a new type of designer that thinks specifically about data protection. And they wanted to learn more, so they were quite curious as to how they could find out more without having to go through complex legal documents. So we did find that the cards stimulated creative thought, which was really nice, and designers began to critique existing approaches. So the systems architects were brilliant, actually. So one of the the things that they had to develop was, or the thing they had to develop was a driverless car. And they were saying, and they got explicit consent, and they were thinking, okay, how do we deal with explicit consent with a driverless car? And they're thinking, right, when you sit down in the car, that's when the terms and conditions are projected on the windscreen. Can you imagine this as a system? So, yeah, you sit in your car, you open the door, you close it, terms and conditions come up like the first scene of Star Wars, literally, like scrolling in front of you, yeah. And they were saying, how do we deal with the signal of assent, right? How do we deal with that? Well, it's when you put your key into the ignition, that's when you're agreeing to the terms and conditions. And they were perfectly content with this solution for about 3 or 4 minutes before one of them sort of went, hang on a minute, haven't we just designed the ubiquitous computing version of terms and conditions? It was just like, yes, you have, you know, with the tick box. So they sort of became gradually aware of this, I guess, the irony of the kind of things they were saying, which was quite interesting. That's not to say they really wanted to focus on data protection, it's just a point. But the most successful people were the people, in terms of engaging with these principles, were those that were designers from human-computer interaction or creative industries, because they're already arguably thinking about design from a human-centric perspective, so this wasn't a massive leap for them. Okay, so future work. We've extended the European, the regulations cards to include a few additional things. So third country data transfers, auditing, provenance and accountability, and data anonymisation. And we're going to extend it further in the coming year. So we'll be working with yet more legal academics to try and develop a more comprehensive list of things that we think the designers would need to engage with. And they can use them either in this creative way, or they can use them as flashcards, which actually the people that have been using our system that we didn't approach directly, that just emailed us to say they're using them as flashcards. And this is our team. So we were interested in developing a deck for the US. So I spoke to somebody at NSF, and they said they'd be happy to fund it if we found an American partner. So we have an American partner at NYU, and we've also got Intel interested, Microsoft Redmond interested, and the University of Nottingham. So we're going to be testing these cards or principles similar to this within an industry context, but then also in educational context. So the other issue, of course, is that these, you know, all of these systems designers have gone through a computer science education, or most of them will have done, but none of them have learnt very much about law. So we're going to put workshops into comp sci undergrad programs, basically, to get people thinking more creatively about these kind of issues. Yeah, so we've got an extension of the deck, and we're going to be developing a system which is done actually, but it'll be out sort of in probably about the middle of the year, that allows you to put all of your information if you want to create your own cards and then send them to a printer. And we're going to make all these cards available under Creative Commons, so the idea is free, everybody uses it, and we're all happy. And if you want to look at what they currently look like, there they are at www.designingforprivacy.co.uk. So I think that concludes, yeah.